Good evening, Mr. Daniel. Can you hear me?
I hear you. Hi, how are you?
Hi, I'm great. How about you? It must be like 10 p.m. in New York. How are
Yes, it's a
you?
little.
Thank you so much for joining us today. So shall we start?
Yeah, let's go ahead.
Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of our organizing committee, we would like to welcome you to Knowledge Room. My name is Hoang Lang, a business majored freshman at Swinburne, Vietnam. And this morning, we will have two fascinating speeches from our keynote speakers. To start off the day, please welcome Director of Strategic Partnerships at United Nations Women, Mr. Daniel Seymour. He previously served as United Nations Women's Director of Humanitarian Action and Crisis Response Office and Deputy Chief of Staff Strategic Planning Advisor to the Executive Director. He began his career as Save the Children UK's first human rights officer. He joined the UN with UNICEF in 2002, working first in the Child Protection section of Program Division, then as Planning and Social Policy Officer in the Vietnam Country Office, and finally as Chef of UNICEF Gender Rights Unit. During that time, he was elected chair of the OECD GAC's Human Rights Task Team. In 2010, he went to the United Nations Women to support its establishment. So please welcome.
Well, thank you very much. It's very nice to have the opportunity to talk to you. Thank you for the invite. Can I just check you can hear me okay?
Can you hear me clearly now?
Yes, I hear you clearly. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, super
Very
clear.
good. Okay, great. So, I was asked to talk to you about the ways in which people can prepare themselves or the skills that we value in the context of public service, particularly in the context of crisis, which is very much the defining characteristic, I think, of the time that we're living in and the challenges in front of us, and similarly what we recruit for and the skills that we value in the United Nations, but I think in the sector that I would call public service more broadly. Let me just give you an outline of what I want to talk with you about. I understand I have about 30 minutes, which I'll make sure I stick to. The first, I want to talk about the United Nations and what we look for in our people. But I also want to talk a little bit more broadly about this public sector as a whole. The second thing I want to talk about, and you'll be unsurprised because I'm coming from UN Women, is issues around diversity, equity and inclusion, why they matter, what they are for us. Third, I want to talk a little bit about crisis, why I'm telling you that I think those of you who are thinking about, those of us who work in the business of public service, that crisis increasingly defines what we do and the lens through which we see our work. And then lastly, I want to just talk a little bit about what a career in public service means, and I just very briefly to wrap things up. So those are the four areas I want to talk to you about. Just a little bit about me so you can understand where I'm coming from and the perspective I'm bringing, the biases I may have maybe. As you heard, my name is Dan. I'm the Director for Strategic Partnerships. What that means, in one sense, is I'm a senior civil servant in the United Nations. Directors are generally the most senior level before you get to the political level. So it's not like being a minister or a deputy minister, but it's a civil servant, a career civil servant at the top level under that. I actually lived in Vietnam for 3 years of my life. I understand a little bit of the country, of your country. The language I find very difficult, but my children spent the start of their lives in Vietnam, so I know a little bit about the way people think, some of the culture, and the perspective of the world from Hanoi and other parts of the country. As you can probably see, it's kind of dark here. It is past my bedtime. I have an 18-month-old son right now who wakes me up nice and early. So I'll be as alert as I can be, but please be gentle to me. Also, because it's late, I'm not in my office. This is my daughter's bedroom, in case you're wondering what all the stuff on the wall is. So let me get straight to it. The United Nations I think you're all very, very familiar, set up after the Second World War. And there are many ways of looking at what the United Nations is for, or what it's about. But essentially, there were two big things in the minds of the founders of the United Nations. The first was making sure that the world would be as protected as possible from war. So this idea of peace and security, very much hardwired in, of course, established after the Second World War, very, very brutal and difficult period in history. Also a war where a number of things had happened, but one in particular, the Holocaust, where we had seen what the consequences of unconstrained majority rule could be in terms of the treatment of minorities. Very large numbers of people with disabilities, Roma people, Jewish people murdered on the basis of their identity. So very much also hardwired into the DNA of the United Nations, the protection of minorities from majorities, and the framework of human rights as a system to articulate that. And also a very recent memory of the Great Depression of the 1930s and the idea that absent social safety nets, absent systems to protect people from the extremes of an unconstrained market, that social rights, that food, housing, healthcare, the essentials of a dignified life needed to be guaranteed. So all of these ideas were very much in the minds and the hearts of the founders of the United Nations, and that's very much reflected now in our charter and the things that drive us. And that's true, really, not just for the United Nations. Some of those principles are really very much there in all aspects of the public sector. And I would divide the public sector into three parts broadly. One being the governmental sector. When you work in government, you work for the service of the people of your country and the government of your country. The intergovernmental sector, such as the United Nations, where you work in an organization that is governed by a collection of member states. It could be ASEAN, it could be the European Union, it could be the United Nations, but the intergovernmental sector as a whole has got a slightly different personality. And the civil society sector, the non-governmental organizations, the charities, the Oxfams, the Save the Children's, at the international level, national level organizations as well. Among those three, I've actually worked for all three. I worked in Save the Children, as was mentioned. I've worked in the government, in the foreign ministry of my country, and in the United Nations. And I think one of the things I've learned from that is that all three are very are wonderful places to work, with many things to commend them. But ultimately, the reality is that there is what I would call an inverse relationship between power and ethics in the public sector, by which I mean that the most powerful positions in public service are in government. Government has a mandate, has the authority, has the resources to make decisions that can then be implemented and enacted and have a large impact on people's lives. But ultimately, governments are not ethical per se. Governments exist to serve the interests of the nation. And that is not necessarily the same as what you or I might feel is right or wrong, particularly with regard to people from other countries. At the other end, you have the civil society organizations which have limited power. They don't have the authority to implement policies, to make decisions about national budget allocations. They can advise, they can advocate, a bit different. But they're extremely ethical, very much driven by what they believe is right and wrong. And in the middle, you have the intergovernmental organizations, not quite the authority and the power of a government, but quite ethical in some ways with regard to the mandates that they're given intergovernmentally to carry out. I personally found that in the middle, that intergovernmental space, that suited me best. but other people find they settle differently and are more comfortable in other places. And ultimately, it's up to you where you think and where you find as you go through your career you are most comfortable. The UN is a very desirable employer. It's what some people call a destination employer. There are a lot more people trying to get jobs in the United Nations than there are jobs. Typically, in UN Women, when we advertise for a position, we get between 300 and 400 applicants per position. So it's a desirable place. It's perceived to be a desirable place to work. When you come to the United Nations, I think there's maybe two things I want to flag to you about how you can think about the skills that we look for in our people in the United Nations. The first is I want to share with you a categorization. I'm going to tell you a story about myself to demonstrate this, but broadly speaking, in the United Nations, as in other areas, one typology, if you like, you can apply to the different kinds of roles we have is technical versus management. By which I mean there are positions that we have, policy advisors, technical specialists. In the case of UN Women, they're specialists on women's economic empowerment or ending violence against women. When I worked in UNICEF, they might be specialists on nutrition, on water and sanitation, on health. And these are people who are employed to convey and communicate and add value to the work of others in carrying out programs in particular areas. So they're people who would go and talk to the health ministry in a country and say, well, based on the expertise we have, based on what we see work in other countries, what we see not work in other countries, these are the sorts of things we think you could do to get better results from your health ministry, from your health system in your country. Very, very important role, the technical role. The other stream is the management stream, basically where you take the resources, the financial resources, the technical resources, the human resources of your organization, and you try to organize them in the way that has the maximum impact. And they're quite different sorts of jobs, technical jobs versus management jobs. And I want to just, as I say, I want to tell you a little story, about, what is it now, almost 25 years ago, I was in the Kosovo mission. There was a conflict, a war in a country called Kosovo. And I was there, and I'd been sent there to be a human rights monitor. So I did investigations. And I worked in a smallish office, about 30 people, in a part of Kosovo called Jakova. And I did my job as a human rights monitor, and I had a master's degree in human rights law and theory. I had a training in this area. So I was doing what my technical skill set equipped me for. And that was fine, and I was, happy enough doing that. But my boss one day said to me, that the head of our office said, I'm going to leave. I'm finished now. I want to go and do a different job. I would like you to take over from me as the head of the office, as the manager. And I was surprised by this, but interested, not super certain that I wanted to do it. But I thought I would try it because he was very convincing. So I took that job, and I worked as the head of the office. I did, what I did. One day I was outside of the office. I was in Pristina, in the capital, at a meeting at our headquarters, and I got a call on the radio, because back then we didn't have cell phones. We did everything through radio systems, and I was told, there's a problem with the office. You need to come back. There's a problem. It's urgent that you come back. So I got in my car. I started to head back. It's about a 2-hour drive, and I got within range of the shorter radio system. When I got within range, I could hear a lot of chatter on the radio, and I spoke to one of my senior staff in the office, and I said, "What's going on?" What had happened is that during the night, somebody had come and tried to steal the generator in my office. And we'd had a guard in the office, and they'd gone over the wall, and they'd they'd punched the guard, they'd broken his nose. He was fine, but it was still a problem, and people were concerned, and there was a lot of confusion, a lot of agitation. So finally, I arrived at the office, and I walked in, and when you entered the office, there was a living room, big space, maybe 30 people in the space, and lots of noise, lots of people talking over each other, shouting. And I came in, and I saw all of this, and people saw I was there, and they stopped talking. And I said, right, I want these 3 people in my office to tell me what's going on. You people, you go and do this. You people, you go and do that. Everybody else, leave this room, go back to your offices, do your work. And I went on, and I dealt with the situation. But reflecting back on it that evening, I realized that what had happened was that group of people, without me, had not been able to organize themselves to deal with the situation. With me, they were. I hadn't told them anything they didn't know. I didn't come with any knowledge or expertise they didn't have. But I was able to make them collectively function and be their best, or at least be better, in a difficult situation. And I reflected on it, and I realized that was something that gave me a lot of satisfaction, and a lot of pleasure, feeling that I was able to make other people be better and more successful in themselves, that I was able to contribute that. And that was the point at which I shifted from the technical stream. I've been a reasonably successful human rights specialist. I'd written a number of papers and those sorts of things, to the management stream, and I never really changed from that management stream from then. And what I would say to you is, if you can identify in your career which you are better suited to, whether you are somebody who really enjoys best being that technical expert, or whether you're somebody who enjoys being that manager who makes other people better able to do what they can do. Once you know that, I think that's a very important realization for where you get your satisfaction, and where you get your satisfaction is where you will be your best. And that's a really important thing to remember. So that distinction between a technical role and a management role, the satisfaction of the technical role, being able to say, I concentrated on this task, I delivered it really, really well, versus I added value, I enabled another group of people to be better collectively. Those two sort of streams, those are really, really important for you to sort of be aware of, and balance in terms of what you want to do. And you may be not in a position to identify that now, but at some point, life will take you to a point where you will realize that. And once you realize that, it's important to shape your career accordingly, because that's how you'll be more successful. Second thing I wanted to talk about is the difference between knowledge and wisdom, which is probably a crude way of saying what I want to talk about, but I'll explain again with a short story. There's a saying, you probably have heard this, that knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit, and wisdom is knowing that you shouldn't put it in a fruit salad. It is definitely there's a big difference between knowing things and understanding. When I first started in this line of work of public service, more than 25 years ago, I was, as I said, a human rights specialist, and I was very much able to get into that line of work because I carried in my head a lot of information, particularly about what it said in human rights treaty law. I knew the articles by memory of a significant number of human rights treaties, in particular the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and I remembered case law and many, many things like that. And back in 1995, that was valuable. That was something which I could bring to my organization, and they valued it. Over the next few years, the world changed, and changed dramatically because of the advent of the internet, and then after that, the advent of easy access through browsers, through handheld devices to the information there. And the things that I used to know, like I knew verbatim, I could say word for word what Article 3 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child said. but pretty much so could anybody else with their phone. They could just Google Convention on the Rights of the Child, look to Article 3, and they would know what I knew in 30 seconds. So this thing I had that I could sell as a special value to my employer because I knew all these things wasn't really very valuable at all of a sudden. That was a very, very significant change, you know, in the world of work, in the sector that I worked in. Instead, what became valuable was the ability to connect knowledge, that layer on top of saying, well, in order to solve this problem, I can take some of this knowledge of health, some of this knowledge of human rights, some of this knowledge of diplomacy and political structures, and put it all together to achieve a result, whether it's for children, for women and girls, you know, wherever I was working. And that ability to connect knowledge is very, very key to how the United Nations works and what we value. We want people not so much who know one thing in great depth, but more people who have the ability to know not necessarily lots of things in depth, but to know where to go to get the pieces that you need to find the very best solutions. Our representatives, our heads of office, are recruited not because they know more than anyone else, but because they know how to take the skills, the expertise, the knowledge of others and put it together in the most effective way. It's not about being the instrument in the orchestra, it's about being the conductor. So that's actually reflected, just to give you an example of that, in the way that our interviews work. We used a form of interviewing called competency-based interviewing. It's also called behavior event interviewing. And what that means is when you do an interview for at least the parts of the United Nations where I've worked, we won't really test your knowledge. We assume, because we can see what qualifications you have, what jobs you've done, we assume you know what you know. We might give you a written test to check, but on the whole, we're not going to test your knowledge. What we're going to do is ask you to tell us stories about how you have done things in the past. So we might say to you, tell me about a time where you worked with other people to achieve a policy result. Tell me about a time when you faced a big challenge working in your team that was stopping you getting something done. How did you deal with it? Because what we believe is those stories about how you've done things in the past tell us about how you will do things in the future. And what we care about is how you do things, your ability to bring skills together from a team, from a number of people, your ability to contribute to a team. We don't care so much about your deep knowledge in one particular area. So what that means for you is, as you build your career and you go through things, being thoughtful about the stories you're building that show you and how you think and how you do things, how you solve problems. You want to be prepared to present not what you know, but how you behave, because that's what we want to understand. That's what we want to know. So I've said a lot about the United Nations as an employer. I'm going to go quickly through then the other things I want to talk about. First of all, diversity, equity, inclusion. Why is it important? We are very, very focused in the United Nations on making sure that our workforce is diverse in terms of the countries that people come from, diverse in terms of gender, diverse in terms of sexual orientation, gender identity, ethnicity, and disability. And we do that because we know that, first of all, we want to reflect the world we want to achieve and live in. We want to live in a diverse and equal world where everybody is treated respectfully and equally, but also we know that there are costs to inequality and to lack of diversity. For example, the consultancy firm McKinsey estimates that the cost of gender inequality as one failure of diversity to the global economy is about $28 trillion. So we know that difference makes teams stronger and better able to serve clients, and that's why we make sure that our teams are diverse. In the private sector, you see a similar growing realization that boards and leadership and senior management that is diverse performs better. Employees expect to work in places that are diverse, globally speaking. Consumers, clients expect diversity. So that's really important to us. And that ability to appreciate, to understand, and to leverage and take advantage of the diversity around you is a really important skill in my sector, at least, in the 21st century. You have to be able to see what's so great about being in a team with people from all around the world who see things differently, different perspectives, different cultures. I also wanted to talk about crisis. Vietnam is not a country which is unfamiliar with crisis, whether it's flooding or drought, and historically also the crisis of conflict and war. And we do live in a time of increasing crisis. Climate change is driving it, but climate change also drives conflict and war, for example, through water shortages. And it also drives crises relating to health. I was in Vietnam in 2005-6 when we had the bird flu scare. These relate to also changes in the weather, but very much the sorts of things that we're dealing with, whether it's the war in Ukraine, whether it's recovering from COVID, whatever it may, or whether it's hurricanes that are increasingly driven by climate change. That's very much kind of at the core of what we do as public servants. In that area, we are looking for people who can be resilient, because crisis contexts are very demanding physically, emotionally. People who can be impartial. In conflicts, it is extremely easy to see one side or another as being in the right or in the wrong. But we can't do our job effectively if we don't have the self-control to be impartial and not become emotional about the situation we're in. But particularly the ability relating to that to negotiate, to be a diplomat, to find solutions in very difficult situations where people have reached a point where solutions are hard to find. To be a third party, to be external, to have that distance and that overview that allows you to bring solutions to people who are unable to find them without you. And this leads really to one of the last things I want to suggest to you. When I started in this line of work, a lot of my senior colleagues had grown up, professionally speaking, in the 1980s, even the 1970s. And that was a period very much defined in the international public service sphere by decolonization. Colonial powers, particularly in Africa, were leaving, and they left behind them states and systems of governance that had very, very limited capacity. And essentially the model for how the United Nations worked and how a lot of NGOs worked, the way in which many rich governments, former colonial governments, would engage with supporting development, presumed what I would call the incompetent state, meaning there was an assumption that the governments of those countries didn't know how to look after themselves, and that foreigners needed to come in to tell them what to do, to help them understand what to do. In 2022, that is not the situation at all. I mean, I recall when I was working for UNICEF in Hanoi, many of my counterparts in government were as educated, more educated than me. They knew things I knew extremely well, far from incompetent, extremely expert and capable people. When we look at COVID recovery, we can see that this idea that there are competent, capable, rich country governments in North America or in Europe, and there are incompetent governments in the global south, in Africa, or in Asia. It's just not true at all, totally untrue. Governments in the south are just as capable, many performing better in terms of managing, for example, COVID and COVID recovery. So we are at a different place where these public service institutions need to think about their role and need to evolve beyond doing what they were used to doing back in this era of the assumption of the incompetent state. And instead, what we need to do as international civil servants, as people working in public service, is to find ways to what I would call broker global public goods. What I mean is there are issues facing all of us in the world, like peace and security, like climate change, like global health challenges, like the internet and what we call the digital commons, the ways in which technology will serve or hurt all of us, like the management of outer space. These are all things that can only be addressed collaboratively and collectively. And that's why this issue of diversity is even more important, because we can only achieve and facilitate and broker international agreement if we can understand and navigate the broadest set of perspectives. We cannot bring the world together if who we are is only a part of the world. We really have to have in our numbers, in our staff, people who really reflect all of those perspectives from across the world, which is why I just want to finish by saying that, I hope many of you will consider a career in public service. I think it is the most direct expression of global citizenship that there can be, to dedicate your career and your professional output to making the world better. We do live in a time of great challenges, what people call the 3 Cs: conflict, crisis, and COVID. And we need the best people more than ever. We need diversity. We need different perspectives. We need people who are able to bring the threads together, who are able to take diverse expertise and orchestrate it, coordinate it, so that it achieves the best possible results in addressing the challenges and the crises that we have in front of us today. I can tell you, I started off, when I left my first degree at university, I was 21 years old. Didn't really know what I wanted to do. Went and worked in business. I ended up working in marketing. Wasn't really for me. Made a change. Did my master's in human rights and moved into public service. And I've never regretted that. And I don't intend to disparage or in any way denigrate what anybody does with their life. But what I can tell you is that this is something to do. It's a great privilege to do a job like this and this kind of work. And I hope I've given you some sense of not just why it's important, but how, if that is what you want to do with your career, how you can position yourself, how you can develop yourself to be successful and make the biggest contribution you can possibly make. So let me stop there. And again, thank you. It's very nice to have the opportunity to talk with you all.
Thank you so much, Mr. Daniel Seymour. I truly agree with your opinion that we as young humans, we need to implement what we know into practices, and we also need to evaluate ourselves to really know what we want to do, what we want to be, and to find out our own pathways. Once again, I want to share my sincere thanks to you for sharing your really valuable sharings, and we truly learned a lot from you. So thank you once again for joining with us today. And good night.
Thank you.
So now we will have a short 15 minutes break until the next session. So all the audiences, we can have a short break. We have prepared a tea break here, so you can all enjoy it. Thank you once again for joining with us today.